Good afternoon. I'm Adam Greer with NOx, and we are very excited today to bring this webinar to you. Back at the PPI spring meeting a few months ago, we had Mark Bridgers come and speak, and unfortunately we ran short on time. And so today we're going to have an opportunity for him to really deep dive in a range of topics that are impacting our industry. We know that particularly over the last couple of years, it's been a wild ride with market volatility, and I don't know that that's going to go away, but Mark's going to expand on some of the global and more local topics that are impacting our market and a forecast for the future and maybe some steps we as an industry can take to support the needed growth. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Mark Bridgers from Continuum Capital. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Look forward to your talk today. Hold your questions to the end. You can send them in anytime through the chat. And at the end of the presentation, we'll pan to those and address viewer questions as well.
I want to thank each of you for attending today. Those of you who attended the recent PPI conference will know that the time was cut short and the 350 slides that I had developed for the time frame did not get utilized. So in this case, I've reduced it to 150, so I'm very excited to share all 150 key topics with you today. I've updated many of the materials from when we were together just a couple of months ago, in part because there have been so many dynamic things that are happening in both the economy and the construction markets and then more broadly globally. I'm going to touch on each of those as we go through, but I've refined the theme that we talked about at the session previously into this idea of what's called VUCA. Some of you may have heard this term before, and I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the trajectory and the perspectives in the market, which will tie back into this VUCA construct. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the economic insights, and then I'm going to come back and touch on each of the market segments in order to provide some deeper understanding of what's happening there. So with that said, this idea of VUCA talks about this concept of volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity, and how do you deal with that as a business manager? When you look at how we're thinking about this, we're looking at this short-term idea of over the next 12 to 24 months. What is your perspective on what's taking place? And with that said, you're going to have to make a choice as you manage your business. Do you envision an environment that's becoming more volatile, more complex, more uncertain, more ambiguous, or perhaps do you envision an environment that is becoming more stable? Depending upon your perspectives would dictate how you would deal with it. We've laid out two scenarios, and the challenge is you can't have a foot in each boat. You've got to make a choice from a business management standpoint because the set of conditions that you would use to deal, the set of strategies you would use to deal with a more volatile environment are very different than the strategies you would use to deal with in a more stable environment. So when you're looking at this, I want you to be thinking about that as we go through the materials. Longer term, we see the market moving in a direction where there's going to be more measurement, there's going to be more quality control demands, there's going to be more risk management, risk elimination requirements. And what this means is if you're a producer of a particular product and you simply want to sell that product at a profit and move on to the next customer, you're going to be challenged in this environment because the customers are going to be demanding more than simply the product. How do we ensure that the product meets quality requirements? How do we ensure that it does that consistently? How do we measure the installation of that product and ensure that it meets the standard installation characteristics? How do we identify risks that could tie into manufacturing, could tie into logistics, could tie into supply chain, could tie into installation quality? How do we identify those risks and help the owner of that ultimate asset manage and control those risks? If you, like I, believe we're entering an environment that is going to be more volatile going forward, you're going to have to find a way to get your head wrapped around those challenges. Let me give you another way to think about this VUCA construct. Many of you will recall this chart that I presented at the recent conference that looks at the supply chain disruptions that have taken place. And there's a key construct here that I want to kind of point out. If you look at what's happening on this particular chart going backwards in time, you can see that there's volatility in terms of what this metric is measuring. But that volatility is relatively light and relatively low peaks and low valleys in the scheme of things. You move into the 2020 time period as the pandemic began to accelerate, and all of a sudden you see this spike in volatility that's occurring. And so this particular measure was developed by the New York Fed, and what it is testing is a series of indices that look at how the supply chain is functioning across the globe and then measures how much different is that particular index from its historic average. Those of you who perhaps studied statistics or engineering may recall this idea of standard deviation. And so you have what's called a normal bell curve. That normal bell curve will have wings on each side, or ends. And then you have what's called standard deviations, which measures the distance from the mean or the average, which is the midpoint of that bell curve. A single standard deviation from a mean or an average is typically going to pick up around 66% of the observations. The second standard deviation is going to pick up something in the 89 to 90% of the observations, and the third standard deviation is going to pick up somewhere in the 98 to 99% of the observations. Something that falls outside of the third standard deviation is very rare. You're talking about something that's happening less than 1% of the time, and in some instances, something that might be in the fourth or fifth standard deviation is happening at 1/10 of 1% of the time. When you look at what's occurring here in these measures, you can see that in 2020, we exceeded the third standard deviation. In 2021, we exceeded the fourth standard deviation. We now are talking about a situation where you're experiencing disruptions in the supply chain that are unprecedented going back in time and are highly disruptive and meet this construct of volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. You can also see that that's beginning to improve as we've entered into 2022, but we are still at the third standard deviation, which is way outside of what would be considered normal. In terms of the economic conditions, there's a lot of things that have been happening, and I'm going to touch on some of the key points here. First of all, GDP. We've begun to see a decline in GDP as we've entered into 2022. We had sizzling growth during 2021. By definition, we're going to fall back from that growth, but the decline has been more aggressive and more unexpected than we had anticipated. And so you're talking about a situation that's being dealt with in seasonal conditions, the inflation, and the interest rates increasing. These are items that are causing this slowdown in GDP. We're anticipating that GDP is going to stay on this trajectory until we get interest rates and inflation under control, which means that we are likely either already in a technical recession or we're going to be entering one later this year. Now, with that said, we're anticipating that this recession is going to be relatively short and relatively shallow, but there are some conditions that if they persist, it is going to lengthen that. One of those conditions is long-term inability to get inflation under control, and then the corollary to that is that interest rates will continue to rise in the attempt to try to get inflation under control. Second, job growth. We had a very aggressive job growth during the vast majority of 2021. That's begun to decelerate month over month. You're also starting to see the number of jobless claims increase as we've entered in this time period. Normally, the summer months are the months where you have the highest employment because of seasonal work. That is not occurring so far this year, probably tied back into some of the inflation and the interest rate pressures that we're experiencing. A key point here, though, is the workforce participation. This is the real issue as it relates to labor and unemployment. When you hear unemployment statistics quoted on the news or perhaps in the newspaper, you might hear an example of 3.3% or 3.5% or 3.8% unemployment. This is speaking to the definition of people who meet the definition of unemployed, which means that it's somebody who does not have a job and somebody who is actively looking for work. If you're not actively looking for work, you do not meet the definition of unemployed. And so that measure currently is not a good guide for what the unemployment is. If you look at labor participation, there's approximately 38% of Americans who are not working who are of working age. Now, some portion of them have very valid reasons for not working. They might be a stay-at-home spouse, they might be a volunteer at an institution, they might be in school of some type, but there also is some significant portion that could be working. Until we figure out how to get them back engaged in the workforce, we're not going to see this economic growth that might potentially help adjust the GDP that we're currently experiencing. Interest rates. Those of you who've been following the Federal Reserve activity, the Federal Reserve has aggressively begun raising interest rates. They have moved faster and higher than any time in the last 40 years. You've got to go all the way back to the early 80s when Paul Volcker was responsible for the Federal Reserve to see these type of interest rate moves. These are going to definitely decelerate the economy. The only question is to what degree and when will that begin working. When you look at inflation, this is something that is very present for everybody. We've now gotten into the point where we have exceeded the level of inflation that is digestible in terms of the growth of the economy. The slowdown of GDP is making the inflation even worse. The best type of inflation to have is inflation that is paired with fast growth economy, because that makes it more digestible. A slowing growth economy and inflation is much more problematic. Those of you who are old enough to remember, there was a period in the 70s called stagflation, which was prior to that point believed to be impossible, which is a situation where you have inflation but a shrinking economy. And so we're on the precipice of potentially something like that looking forward in this time period. The PPI, which is the Producer Price Index, that's a measure that normally doesn't get quoted. That's twice as much as CPI, which is a retail good inflation that we're currently experiencing, and energy goods even exceeds that. This gives you kind of a flavor for what's going on across the economy and some of the big picture takeaways. I'm going to now go into a little bit more detail. When you look at GDP, you can see that we had a slowdown in the first quarter of 2022. That type of slowdown in GDP is not unprecedented because it's tied back into the seasonal conditions. That is typically the slowest growth quarter in the U.S., but the negative growth experienced is something that is viewed as problematic, and whether or not we can bounce back from that in the second quarter. We won't have the second quarter results for probably another month or so. And so the speculation at this point in time is that we're going to have either very flat growth or possibly negative growth again. If we have negative growth again, that will meet the definition of a recession. And so if we have a slight increase in growth, that will not meet the definition of recession, and that will be pushed off a little bit farther in the future. But the question of deceleration, that is already happening, and that is for certain in comparison to the growth rates that we were experiencing last year at this time. When you look at the Consumer Confidence Index, this is a measure of how consumers are feeling about the overall economy. The way that this is measured is on a month-to-month basis, and so the way that it's presented in this graph is on an annual basis. What has occurred on a month-to-month basis is we've gone from approximately 115. Anything over 100 is very positive. The higher than 100 is much more positive. And then anything below 100 is a negative perception or negative confidence in the economy. What you've seen is a transition from 115 back in December of last year. That was before inflation began to accelerate and became clear what was happening. And now we're at 98. We've gotten to the point now where there is fear from a standpoint of the general public and how they're looking at the economic condition. In terms of unemployment, we already spoke about this to some extent, but you can see that the unemployment rate in terms of how it's traditionally measured is very, very low. That's in part because there's a large portion of the population, again, that 38 million, that are not actively searching for work. If they were to begin searching for work, you would see these unemployment rates start to go back up. That's what's happened over the last 2 months in the preliminary unemployment statistics that have been produced by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. You've seen a slight increase in unemployment, but it's gone up from about 3.3 to 3.8%, which is not huge, but it speaks to this concern that's happening in the economy. Maybe a question or two at this point.
Yeah, Mark, just from your statistical background and knowledge, is this level of unemployment consistent? Have we seen this before in the past? I mean, that's a huge number of people that could be working. And one of the concerns we continue to hear from our membership is we could put out more products if we had more skilled labor.
Yeah, the situation that we're currently in is unprecedented. And so if you look backwards in time, let me back up for a second. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, the perceived floor for the unemployment rate was considered about 4.5%. The rationale for that was once unemployment dips below that 4.5% point, you're attempting to attract people into the workforce who don't really want to work. And so the idea that they would be transitory, that there would be challenges associated with holding their employment, that there would be skill level issues, that kind of made good logical sense. Post that period, we had multiple years with unemployment well below 4.5%, and what was determined was that you have a situation where the unemployment rate can be pulled down below that 4.5% point and not create an inflationary period. And so the historic rationale was once you get below that 4.5%, you're starting to increase wages, you're trying to figure out how to pull people in. That by definition becomes inflation, and so you want to try to balance those two things. Those constructs have basically been thrown out at this point. And so the floor right now is undefined because the workforce participation has changed so significantly from what it had been in the past. To give you a frame of reference, prior to 1970, workforce participation was normally in the 60 to 65% range, which basically was male employment almost at full employment and some percentage of women employment in that time period. Post-1970, as women began to enter the workforce very aggressively, you saw workforce participation move up into the 70 and the 72% range. The remainder of the workforce, that 30% roughly, was people who were not working because, generally speaking, they were doing something else. A student, they were a stay-at-home parent of some type, so forth and so on. What's occurred since we peaked at about 72% is that has been falling slowly over time. Pre-2008, when we had the financial collapse globally, the workforce participation was approximately 67%, 66, 67%, slightly below that 70%. After the 2008 financial collapse, you saw that figure go down about 5% to the 61, 62% range, and then not come back up. And then during the Trump presidency, it started to move up slightly, and then with the pandemic, it dropped down even lower. And so you've got a situation where arguably there's somewhere between 4 and 5% of the workforce that was working pre-2008 who is not working today, and there's a very strong argument to be made that they could be and should be back in the workforce. That's a portion of the 38% that I was speaking to. If you find a way to put that percentage of people back to work, you're talking about adding somewhere between 8 to 10 million people back into the workforce. That's going to begin addressing these labor availability issues, begin addressing growth from a GDP standpoint, perhaps even help to bring down some of the inflationary pressure because you've got a wider group of people that potentially could be working.
Thank you, Mark.
When you look at the workforce participation here, as I was describing before, you can see that we have peaked again and are starting to trend back down. One of the challenges is if we don't find a way to put these people back to work, we can't solve many of these problems. When you look at the finance and banking situation, this ties back into the Federal Reserve situation, and there's a couple of nuances here that I want to try to speak to for the audience. First is this idea of what the Federal Reserve is doing. So right now there have been 3 interest rate raises at this point in time. This is the fastest that the interest rates have risen over this time period. And so you've got a situation where the Federal Reserve is acting aggressively to try to get inflation under control. The challenge is the raising of interest rates is specifically designed to address demand. And so if you can slow down demand, in theory, you can slow down inflation. The challenge is if the inflation is not driven by demand, then the adjustment in interest rates are not nearly as effective. When you look at the volatility, when you look at the supply chain challenges, when you look at the geopolitical situation, these are all characteristics that inspire fear. And fear leads to a more hoarding type behavior, which also drives inflation. Raising of interest rates arguably raises the fear temperature and causes more of the behavior that might be accelerating inflation. I think when you look around the industry, and this is just my wandering around, I'm seeing situations where organizations that need access to diesel fuel are hoarding it under the theory that it's going to be more expensive in the future. Organizations that need access to raw materials are hoarding it. Many companies that are using products manufactured by the PPI members are probably placing orders that exceed the amount that they're actually going to utilize because they're concerned about whether or not they're going to have access to these materials. These are all things that speak to hoarding behavior.
Mark, one of the things we think about now in this inflation and hoarding environment, for me personally, I think a deflationary cycle is actually far more scary if prices start to spiral down, and in particular, as a manufacturer, if you start to have prices plummeting and now you have a lot of inventory that you can't move. For a pipe person, that might mean they've got a lot of pipe on the yard. For a manufacturer like us, it means we maybe have a lot of metal in our building. How do we maybe think about that as manufacturers and how to manage that risk, or is that something you pick up later in the discussion?
No, that's a great question, and it's exceptionally challenging to deal with that. So I don't have any evidence to support this, but I strongly believe it. For the manufacturers who are listening today, I am confident that some percentage of the orders that are sitting on their book today are not true orders. They are duplicates of other orders. Now the challenge is what percentage of them and which ones are they? And there's no way to know the answer to that. If you look at the retail situation and take Target or some of the more retail-oriented stores, Walmart and so forth and so on, when you look at what they're experiencing right now, they ramped up orders for their materials, and now they have massive inventories that they have no place to store, and they're trying to figure out how to drive those inventories out of the system. They're lowering prices in order to accomplish that. And so that's one of the things that might take some of the inflationary pressure off, But essentially what is occurring is you've moved from a hoarding-oriented behavior, which caused these excess orders, to an over-inventory-oriented behavior, which is now driving a deflationary period. And so you've got these two conflicting things. I think there's a strong argument to be made that in this plastics manufacturing space and many other manufacturing spaces, what happened in the retail market is about to happen in this space, meaning that we've got to have some sense about what the demand, the real demand is for the products that we're manufacturing. With that said, when I go through each of these sectors, you'll see this, but we are very bullish on the ultimate long-term demand picture for all of the utility segments where the PPI members are sending products. And so from that standpoint, there might be short-term issues, maybe measured in months or possibly a year or two, but looking over a longer-term timeline, these products are going to end up getting used and are going to end up getting installed. It's just a question of how backed up in the system might they end up being if we haven't done a good job of validating the orders. Does that get at the question you were asking?
Yeah, I think this is somewhat like we were talking about earlier today. It's when it rains, I can't tell you how everything's going to get to the ocean. We know that the long term, we know what the market looks like long term, it's healthy, big demand, but the short term is going to be very volatile, right? And so we don't know the short term ups and downs, but we know the long term trend line is up and to the right.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. To make things even more exciting during this time period, this activity by the Federal Reserve is going to end up disrupting the credit market for some period of time. And there's an undercurrent here that's not getting much discussion. And so I'm going to digress down into the weeds just for a moment to help people understand what's going on here. So on the chart on the right, this is a measure of the outstanding credit obligations for individuals all across the U.S. In total, there's $4.5 trillion in outstanding credit. So this is made up of mortgages, made up of credit card balances that are overdue, made up of any type of short-term or long-term financing that an individual would have. And when you look at this chart over time, you'll see that these numbers have been going up, but there was something very interesting that occurred in about the 2010 period. And if you notice on this chart, what you'll see here is there's only one category of credit that's actually growing dramatically during this time period, which interestingly is the federal government portion of it. And the vast majority of the federal government portion of it is tied back into student loans. And so if you look backwards in time, the federal government was in the student grant business primarily. Post-2008, the federal government got into the student loan business. And prior to that point, if you wanted to borrow money to go to school, you had to primarily go to a private lender. And when you went to that private lender, you had to lay out what your plan was, how much it was going to cost, what degree you were going to study, what your employment characteristics were likely to be, and then that private institution would make an underwriting decision about whether or not to loan that money. When the federal government got into this business, the only requirement that was being made was that the institution be accredited, meaning that it met the basic standards in terms of the degree that it was offered. There was very limited underwriting beyond that point. And that's why you see this escalation in federal government offered student loans. If you wanted to go to school and you wanted to borrow money, you simply had to raise your hand and you received those funds. Some very significant portion of these funds have not benefited the individuals, meaning that they owe the money and did not complete the degree. They owe the money and did not end up in the occupation they intended to. They owed the money and went back to school again and created more debt. This is the money that Biden is talking about relieving individuals of. So said another way, he's talking about taking this red portion of the chart and wiping it out, meaning making it go away. And so those individuals would not owe those funds any longer. Now, where does that go in the system? And the answer, of course, is because this is federal government loaned money, the taxpayers are paying this burden. And so as the Biden administration continues to wipe out the student debt, that's going to raise the cost, raise the taxes potentially for the other taxpayers who are funding that write-off. Prior to 2008, there was nothing for the federal government to write off. Post-2008, you have this massive increase in credit that the federal government supported and now has the ability to potentially write it off because they lent the credit. Does that follow? This is going to be one of the biggest challenges. When you look at interest rates going up, you've got a situation where the servicing of this debt becomes much more problematic. So let me just give you a simplistic example. Take somebody who has an adjustable rate mortgage, and let's say a year and a half ago they were at 3.5% on that adjustable rate mortgage. Once that rate renews in the next period, it's going to move up to 5 or 5.5%. You're talking about adding hundreds of dollars to the monthly mortgage payment for that individual. How many individuals have enough income to pay an additional several $100s on top of the inflation that we're currently experiencing? So you're talking about some percentage of this debt is going to become unserviceable in this higher interest rate environment. That is something that is going to affect us more broadly as we look forward. The federal government debt is a completely different problem that I'm not going to go into, but suffices to say there is one primary category of federal government debt that is often discussed. There are 3 other categories that are not discussed. Those debt types in combination far exceed the size of the economy and present real problems in terms of how would the federal government potentially pay these debts back over some longer term timeline. When you look at residential construction, this is the one market, and the tying back into the light commercial market. These are the markets that are likely to be hurt in this recessionary period coming forward. Because they do not have the same type of floor built in because of what's happened from a government spending standpoint. And so we're anticipating seeing a more aggressive slowdown in the residential construction market, driven by a couple of different factors, and also a slight slowdown in the industrial and light commercial market. On the flip side, there is huge demand for rental properties, both multifamily and single family rental properties. That's going to create some support for existing infrastructure, housing infrastructure, and also create some demand for other infrastructure because those individuals have to have somewhere to live. But the question becomes, how do they afford that given this inflationary environment? So you have a couple of fighting factors here that are impacting each other. Mortgage rates are going to be higher before we get out of this current inflationary cycle. Those of you who are old enough to remember, mortgage rates were in the 8 to 14 percent point range in the early 80s. That's something that seems unfathomable given what mortgage rates have been in our recent history, but we're moving to an environment where that level of rate might be within the realm of reason depending upon how much activity is necessary to get inflation under control. And then lastly, we've got this question of, are we a nation of homeowners or renters? When you look backwards in time, the greatest and most powerful vehicle to generate income and wealth for an individual has been home ownership. There's a question of whether or not that will be the case looking forward. When we talk about student debt, and that was on the previous chart, the average graduate of a 4-year school exits with about approximately $37,000 in student debt. Incidentally, $37,000 in debt is the approximate down payment on a starter home of about $250,000 to $300,000. So what you're talking about is an individual that comes out of school with this type of debt today probably can't buy a home because they're servicing that student debt. Student debt also is the only type of debt that is not dischargeable in a personal bankruptcy, meaning that you can negotiate and adjust and eliminate every other type of debt in a personal bankruptcy with the exception of student loan debt. And so in this situation, those individuals might not be able to afford a home. They're going to end up being renters. And when you look at what's going on from a rental standpoint, those individuals likely will be renting for the rest of their lives. And so you've got a situation where somebody that has $37,000 in student loan debt as a 22-year-old will take approximately 20 years to pay that debt off. Well, what's happened between 22 and 42? The answer is they probably have gotten married, they probably have a child, and they've got a situation where now all of a sudden they've transitioned from being able to deal with the student debt into being able to deal with the normal monthly operating expenses, probably still can't buy a home. When you look at the home buying activity that's happened in the U.S., you've seen a dramatic increase in the all-cash offers. You've also seen a dramatic increase in private equity funds becoming home buyers for the simple reason that somebody that is 35 or 40, just about to pay off their student debt, has 2 children, living in an apartment in an urban area, maybe comes to the conclusion that having a suburban home with 2 children makes better sense. They can't afford to buy the home, but they could rent it. And so you see this situation where these private equity companies recognize this trend and are buying up these properties with all cash offers in order to rent them over the longer term. This is something that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. When you look at this is a generational type of an impact, so this is going to be something that's going to persist over the next 20 years or so. terms of inflation, we've already spoken to this topic, but I want to give you a sense of the volatility. Up here is measurement of CPI. This is the traditional measure of inflation. It excludes two critical characteristics, which are energy and food goods. The reason that they're excluded is because they're particularly volatile. And that changes the underlying inflation perspectives when you include them into the measure. And so what this is showing right now, the most recent measure was 9.1%. That's inflation that far exceeds what's digestible by normal activity. And so you've got a situation where that's not the real inflation that individuals are experiencing. When you look at food and energy goods, you're talking about inflation that's in the 30 to 40% range. Let's just assume that half of your expenditures are in food and energy and the other half are in other things. If you average those two together, you're talking about something that's in the 20% range, which is completely undigestible in this current environment. This is not something that can persist for any length of time without creating some type of significant recessionary period. On top of this is the producer price index. This is the green overlay on this chart, and I've kept them one on top of the other just to give you a sense of the volatility. But you can see that the producer price index, which is the measure of business to business inflation as opposed to customer to retail oriented inflation, it is much more volatile than the CPI. This is a better measure of the inflation that the PPI members and their customers are experiencing. And so this is something that is exceeding the level of price increase that probably can be addressed with customers. Just to give you an example, one of my construction customers that I've been doing business with, they had a senior management meeting last month in June to talk about the price increases that they felt like were necessary based on the inflation that they're experiencing since the start of the year. They went through all the math, looked at the costs that they're incurring, and this is terrifying to me, but 50% of the profit margin that was embedded in their pricing to their customers has been destroyed simply by the fuel costs that they're incurring in order to move the crews around to service those customers. Half of the profit is gone. And then when they went through the rest of the inflation that they're experiencing, they're looking at a situation where they may need to raise prices anywhere from 8 to 12% in this year simply to get back to a break-even type of a cost structure. This type of cost increase is what is being experienced by almost every contractor that's operating in this environment. And the PPI members who are raising the prices because their raw materials and logistics have increased, they're contributing to that cost increase that's then being pushed downhill. And so this is not something that is easily digestible. You're not talking about a 1 to 2% price increase. You're talking about increases that are going to cause customers to step back and say, okay, if this is the true number and we're forced to pay this, we're going to have to change the way that we're spending money or change the scope of the work in order to get back within what would be reasonable in terms of our ultimate expenditures. That's going to ultimately be pushed back uphill to the PPI members over some longer time period. The last measure is energy goods. And so this is the exact same charts, but with energy goods overlaid here. You can see that the energy goods is even more volatile than the PPI, and in this current cycle is twice as much. So you're talking about going from something in the 9 to 10% range for CPI into the 20 and 25% range for the PPI into the 30 to 40% range for energy goods. This is something that is not sustainable, and if you look backwards in time at recessionary periods, you can see that these types of peaks in energy goods and PPI have led to recessionary periods. And so this is not something that I see a path for us to work our way out of, but I'm also a believer that this is going to be a shorter and less problematic recession based on the conditions that we're anticipating at this point in time. This is a measure of energy goods around the globe. Given what's occurring in Europe with the Ukraine invasion and then also the stranglehold that the Russians have over gas in Europe, you can see that the prices for natural gas in Europe have peaked over here in the green color, and these have exceeded anything that has existed going back in time. Just to give you kind of a frame of reference on the dollars and cents, let's say that U.S. gas is about, natural gas is about $4, okay? It takes about another $4 to $8 in order to liquefy and transport that gas. So you've got $4 plus, let's say, $8. That gets you to $12. So you've got $12 gas in order to send that gas as LNG to some other location like Asia, like Europe. Going backwards in time, The cost of gas in Europe was in the $9 to $12 range. The cost of gas in Asia was in the $12 to $16 range. And so there wasn't enough differential to make the math work, to send LNG to either of these locations. When you look at the numbers that we're experiencing both in Asia and in Europe today, there is plenty of headroom to potentially do this. The challenge is you would have to build infrastructure in the U.S. in order to create the opportunity to capture natural gas, to then liquefy it, and then to send it some other place. The building of this infrastructure, or the utilization of this infrastructure, is measured in years. And so you don't have an opportunity to address the current situation that exists, and making that type of an investment with a speculative expectation over what the long-term prospects look like is limited. That's part of the reason that you've seen efforts to try to reverse some of the import facilities that had already been constructed, potentially complete other facilities that were partially constructed, or accelerate the construction of existing facilities. But these are bigger picture geopolitical questions that don't have easy answers. And until we get to a more stable global environment, we're not going to have clarity about what to do here. This is another example of this VUCA construct and how we're going to deal with this. There's some individuals that look at this and say, this is what our future looks like. I happen to be one of them. There's other individuals that look at it and say, we're going to return to normal over some period of time. That happens not to be my belief. So when you look backwards in time to the previous recessionary periods, the 70s and the 80s offer two interesting cycles. This is a chart that you all will not have seen before, but it is a measure of contractor bankruptcies during these periods of time. So you can see there was a peak in the 74 time period. There was another peak in the 85, 86 time period. These peaks are when contractors could not survive in the markets they were operating in. In that 70s period, there were a couple of interesting things happening during that time period. One of which was there was significant government spending that was taking place from the 60s into the early 70s. The Vietnam War was one of those significant government expenditures. You also saw an energy shock that began in the 1973 into the 1974 time period. And then many of the construction contracts that were in existence during that time period did not have escalator clauses in them, meaning that there was no out for the contractors to get some of these cost increases covered during these high inflationary time periods. And that drove many contractors out of business during that period. And there was also the stagflation period that occurred starting in about 74-ish onto about 78 to 79-ish, where you had inflation that was occurring during a period where the economy was decelerating or getting smaller. That's something that was unprecedented prior to that point. And so this was a very volatile time period. Again, meets the definition of that VUCA construct that we talked about before. As you move into the 80s, you have a different set of characteristics. That was also a very high inflationary period. And then there were two very significant recessions that occurred as Paul Volcker was able to eventually get inflation under control. Those recessions were extremely severe and punished markets all across the U.S. The Texas market was one that was particularly punished because that was also a slowdown in the oil and natural gas market, in addition to the general markets that were slowed down because of the recessionary time period. And the contractors that went bankrupt in that 80s period primarily couldn't cash flow the difference between their costs and the collection of their receivables during that time period. The contractors that went bankrupt in the 70s, they could not absorb and couldn't deal with the cost differential associated with the inflation. And so you've got two very different outcomes that are very different drivers of the similar outcomes during that time period. As you look forward into the future, I actually don't anticipate this type of bankruptcy in the utility construction space because there's a floor under the construction activity. There also are escalator clauses built in most of the contracts today. And so I see an ability for professionally run contractors to manage more successfully through this period. And I don't anticipate, again, a very severe type of a contractor bankruptcy situation that was experienced in these two previous periods. Go ahead, David.
So, Mark, along those lines, cities have budgets and users have budgets. At some point, yes, the contractor can raise the price, but in your experience, does the city pull back because it's outside their budget, right? There's a limited amount of money they have blessed to spend. So with the idea that there is this underlying floor that the government's created with this stimulus, right, this infrastructure bill, maybe go into a little more detail on your experience there. this helps those professionals operate that have those types of contracts, but I'd imagine maybe the smaller regional players are going to struggle more in that environment?
That's correct. And each market's going to behave differently. So as an example, the gas distribution market, what's going to occur there is the spending in that market is a function of the capital structure of the entity that's making the spend. And so there's a certain amount of spend that can be afforded given that capital structure and the rate base. And so what will end up happening, and this will start occurring at the back end of this year, is that you're going to see reductions in scope of projects, but not reductions in spend. So as using a simplistic example, let's say that a utility had $100 million anticipated for spend. They're still going to spend $100 million. They're simply going to reduce the scope from 100% to 90% or 85%. That means there's going to be less pipe sales in order to service that, but that's not going to create a cratering of the market. And again, using the gas distribution space, that scope is simply going to be pushed into the future. It's not going to go away. And so you have a situation where as this inflationary pressure begins to accelerate, these scopes are going to end up getting pulled back. That's going to create a little bit less sales. We've talked about this question of over-ordering that might be occurring. Some portion of that over-ordering is going to tie back into this reduction in scope, where somebody ordered anticipating 100% scope, they're going to install, given an 85% scope, the 15% will in effect be an over-order. And so that is going to happen this year. The other markets are going to behave differently. Water and sewer, as an example, they're primarily municipal markets. Most municipalities and most states operate on a 2-year budget cycle, which means that these types of problems don't start to show up until you get into the next budgeting cycle. And so that means that for the suppliers and the manufacturers of products, they need to be looking in the 2023, 2024, 2025 timeframe for municipal related impacts, because that's when they're going to begin to show up if there is some deceleration in state or municipal budgets. On the flip side, 2021 and 2022 are likely going to be two of the largest tax collection years for almost every state. And so you're going to end up seeing budget surpluses in many states because of the acceleration in tax revenue over these two time periods, which will be running counter to what's happening economically because the taxes are a function of the previous year. And so the municipal market will be farther in the future. The telecom market, as an example, and the residential and the light commercial market, they're going to be more responsive to the current economic conditions. On the telecom side, it is possible to see some slowdown in scope of activities based upon inflation and other challenges in terms of funding. But I see that market, there is insatiable demand for faster, more data quantity. And I see that overriding some significant portion of the inflationary pressure, meaning that people will simply stomach paying more for that type of infrastructure. And so I see that as an offset from the economic conditions. When you look backwards in time, the telecom market had historically been the most volatile construction market in terms of year-to-year percentage changes in construction spending, both up and down. That volatility exited the market in about 2012, and that market has been much more stable. There's still ups and downs, but much more stable, in part because the data demand and bandwidth demand has been so insatiable that you don't see this switching on and off of capital construction activity, and I think that will persist going forward. And so in the residential and the light commercial, that again will be responsive to the economic conditions. Those are the two markets that I think are likely to be hurt the most in this current environment, but the long-term prospects for those markets are exceptionally good. The floor that we talked about, this ties back into the infrastructure bill. And just to give you a frame of reference, the 2008 American Recovery Act was actually a larger bill than the Infrastructure Act passed last year. But the 2008 bill had approximately $100 billion in construction-related activity in it. The current infrastructure bill has approximately $500 billion in construction activity. And so this bill is going to be 5 times more impactful than the 2008 bill. And so you're talking about a pretty substantial floor that's going to be built under almost all of the utility construction markets given this act. So let me just give you a frame of reference. Let's say that there is a massive economic collapse in the U.S. over the next 2 years that extends into a long recessionary period, and there's a deceleration in the ability to finance and build private infrastructure. So we're down to something that's a much smaller market. There's $65 billion in this act, and there's an additional $30 billion in state-related acts. So you're talking about $90 billion simply in telecom-oriented spending that has already been budgeted, already been set aside, and is going to occur over the next 3 to 7 years. And so that's going to create that floor in these markets, even if there is something like a total economic collapse. The same thing is true in the transportation markets, in the water and sewer markets, and so this floor is going to bring that stability to these markets, and this is one of the reasons that we're so bullish on all of these markets looking forward over the long term. So when you look at these two constructs, this idea of volatility, this is a scenario that we put together to give people a way to think about this. The upper part of the scenario is a narrative that describes kind of the nature of the scenario. The lower part speaks to some of the specifics. So as an example, in this volatile environment, we see a political push for renewable power that raises power prices, and the infrastructure is not ready to digest that renewable power. That's going to introduce volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity, complexity into the marketplace. So this meets the definition of that VUCA construct that we talked about before. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but as you look through the bullet points that are here, these are all things that are introducing some aspect of this VUCA construct into the market. When we look at what the markets are likely to feel and look like going forward into the future, something like this is what we see. This is not a forecast. This is simply a picture painted to give you a sense of what one future might look like. On the flip side is something that looks more like a return to normal. And so if you think back to that supply chain chart that I showed at the beginning, going all the way back to the early 90s, yes, there's volatility, but it's within one standard deviation of the mean, meaning that this is digestible, it's understandable, it's budgetable, it's measurable, and we can deal with that type of volatility. And this scenario assumes that we return to something that looks like that, where we have a much more stable business environment, much more stable geopolitical condition, much more stable construction and manufacturing environment. And there's some characteristics that are described here where instead of an aggressive acceleration into renewable power, we have a much more balanced acceleration into renewable power, balancing the costs and the management of the grid. So this is an example of how we turn something that is volatile into something that is more manageable by adjusting the timeline over which it gets done. So with that, I want to touch on some of the key markets. Each page, I've got kind of an overview and touch on the key point that I want to try to get at for that particular page. In this case, broadband markets, there is unrelenting demand for faster broadband, and this is something that's not going to go away. You take the last 2 years, pre-2020, I maybe had done 4 or 5 online webinars, maybe had done 1 or 2 video calls that I can recall. I do a call a week. I do a webinar a week. I totally have changed the way that we deliver our services to our clients from some percent, 100% face-to-face to maybe 80% face-to-face, 20% virtual. And this is something that's going to persist going forward. It is impossible to do that without faster broadband. And this is something that you're going to see going forward where there's going to be faster and faster demands made. I take streaming as an example. Pre-2019, at my home, 2 teenage kids, we had cable, but we had 0 streaming services. 2021, we've got 5 different streaming services. We're paying for cable and 5 services. This is a personal conversation that I'm going to have with my spouse and children about how we afford this. But excuse me. But this gives you a sense about how things have changed just in this 2-year time period.
But you're not going to the movie theater anymore because COVID pretty much killed the movie theaters, right? So yeah, we're all surviving with this, and I feel the pain. I agree with you. I believe there's going to be some sort of hybrid workforce to where you're going to have a couple days in the office for those that can work from home, a couple days working from home. We're looking to hire an individual right now, and that almost is a prerequisite for a new individual to come into any type of admin role or accounting role. They're going to want a couple days from home. That gets exaggerated by fuel costs.
I don't think that's going away.
Right?
Anytime in the near future.
Yeah.
And
maybe
I
never.
don't even think it's a bad thing. I mean,
Right.
how much travel do we all save and kind of regain some
Sure.
time and cost savings by that as well? It's a matter of learning to take advantage of the tool and the opportunity. But yeah, I mean, broadband is here to stay, and it's only growing in the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, just to give you a simple practical example, one of my contractor clients had built a new building on a new plot of land in 2008, and they anticipated it would be a 20-year building, a 20 to 30-year building. Fast forward to 2019, they had already outstripped the capacity of the building and were actively looking for another plot, and we're going to build a larger building. And they were talking about spending $30 to $40 million, in order to accomplish this. And the pandemic occurred. They sent everybody home for a period of time and then brought people back in shifts. And I met with the president recently. He said, we will never need another building. We're going to continue to have the office staff operate in shifts because they like it. We've got the space for it. We've figured out how to get them to perform their jobs from home. And we'll never need to spend this $30 to $40 million that we literally were about to write the check for 2 years ago. And I think that is consistent across all the markets where this has transformed the way that business is going to get done.
But this is definitely isolated to the roles. Again, in the plants that our members are running, you have to have real live people in the plants running them, right? I think there will be a place for automation and robotics to help increase productivity, but that's part of that labor participation challenge. Maybe the people that want to come in, they're coming out of college with a lot of debt, and they want to be able to have those hybrid work roles, but we actually need them in the buildings running equipment and that kind of stuff. So do you see that gap closing in any way?
No, I don't in the short term, and so the same thing is true on the construction standpoint. You can't construct any of this work virtually. Somebody has to physically go out to the job site. And so, in that environment, I don't see a change there. There is a move from a construction standpoint to figure out how to mitigate the demand on labor because the labor and the skilled trades are so challenging to get. Same thing is true on the manufacturing side. What you'll see occur over the next 10 to 15 years is a crew of 4 people, 5 to 7 years from now, will be a crew of 3 people with some type of technology and equipment that basically is replicating what that 4th person did. And so essentially what will occur is the businesses will adapt to that workforce availability that is causing them to change the way things are happening. Back to the manufacturing standpoint, some percentage of robotic activity or remote activity can be applied, which means that instead of a workforce of 100, maybe you need a workforce of 91. And so you'll see that type of adaptation over the long term. But the vast majority of this work is still going to be done by people using their hands and their heads in order to accomplish it successfully.
I mean, we've seen that in several other markets outside of pipe. I mean, I'm thinking back, I grew up in the Southeast, and that was really the home of fiber production. And that was textiles at one point, it was carpets and so forth. And that radically transformed. And 2 examples, there was one in North Carolina where at one point at peak in the 80s, they had 800 employees. Today, they have about 150, and they output 3 times more from the plant.
Exactly.
And Bob Shaw, when he built his new business down there, Engineered Flooring, they completely changed the business model from moving each finished good from one plant to another, put it all under one roof, all air conditioned, attracted at the highest labor rates possible, and they made the most efficient production machine in the world, and they took like 30% of their market in 5 years. It was unbelievable. And
the same thing is going to happen in this market space, I think, as well. Construction, as an example, will be more resistant to that. Manufacturing, I think, will be more adaptive, or at least faster adaptive to it. But take construction as an example. There's an opportunity to streamline a lot of this construction activity, by looking at alternative ways to do it. One of the simplistic examples is to make the construction activity modular in some fashion, and then to construct those modules in a controlled manufacturing environment instead of constructing them stick by stick or pipe by pipe, out in the field. And you're going to see more of that type of activity in order to deal with these types of quality control, measurement, risk mitigation challenges going forward.
Well, and I've seen this as well, particularly in some wire and cable plants, historically kind of dark, hot manufacturing environments. And a lot of those major players over the last few years have upgraded lights, both for efficiency, but they put in air conditioning, which was never the case before.
Sure.
And part of that was about labor attraction and retention.
Yep.
And I think when I think about the pipe plants of the future, it's not just equipment. I think you're going to have fewer headcount, or the same number of headcount, but more output. Somehow you've got to get more done with the same or fewer number of people.
Yep, that's exactly right. And that's going to continue to accelerate. So in this broadband space, the continued use of the cloud infrastructure, again, 2019, we stored everything on servers and individual machines. Today, we're almost 100% cloud oriented. Again, in that 2-year time period, a dramatic transmission. That's consistent across all businesses, moving in that direction. All of that requires more bandwidth in order to support. And this is a market that we see accelerating. There's also an aggressive push to put more of this infrastructure in rural markets in order to make it possible for people who might like to work remotely and live in a rural setting to be able to accomplish that. That's something that is going to get aggressive spending over the next timeline. That's something that's going to be part of the government infrastructure bills as you look forward into the future. And as you get more dense infrastructure and perhaps more efficient construction, you'll see more places that are reachable without money coming from the federal government that is going to be applied. And so this is a market that we're very bullish on. We like the dynamics and the characteristics of it. It's an understandable aspect. We think some of the volatility has been driven out of the market, and this is a market that we see persisting over the long term. This is a map that lays out some of the county, on a county by county basis, that have limited access to high-speed broadband. And so this gives you a sense of where some of the rural money might end up getting spent. You've got similar maps that can be prepared on a county by county basis in order to understand where the activity might take place. And then this is a chart that measures the broadband demand. You can see the exponential increase in the spending, in the demand and use of data in this particular chart. This speaks to how that demand is going to continue to accelerate. You can see that the biggest chunk of this growth is in the video, and the second biggest chunk is in data. Using my family as an example, 2019 to 2022, 0 streaming services to 5 streaming services. And so that specifically measures what's happening in that green portion of this particular chart. In terms of the electric market, there's 2 dynamics that are happening here. There's a societal push and a more liberal political push towards something that looks like an all-electric type of a market environment. And this is something that we have concluded has already reached a tipping point, meaning that this is not something that is, kind of a long-term idea. This is something that's in the process of being implemented today. One of the initial concerns that somebody might have is, well, if we move to an all-electric oriented market, does that mean that the gas distribution market, as an example, is being disadvantaged? And the answer is maybe, and in the sense that you're not going to see as much investment in the gas distribution infrastructure, but all of the investment that's occurring in the electric infrastructure is going to use the exact same product that would have been used in the gas distribution infrastructure if that were being expanded. And so you've got conduit versus pipe construct. And so when we look at what's happening on this electric market, we see a massive investment in underground electric, which is going to demand that conduit in order to make it possible to put that in place. And that conduit is the exact same product that a gas distribution utility would install if they were expanding services. With that said, the vast majority of the spend in the gas distribution market is replacement and safety oriented. And that replacement and safety-oriented spend is going to continue for the foreseeable future. We have a long-range forecast, which is not presented in these materials, but looks at what that gas distribution market might look like. We anticipate a tipping point in the gas distribution market in the 2030 to 2035 time period, which is when that market begins to shrink in terms of construction or peaks, and then begins to shrink in terms of construction spending activity, because the quality of the materials that have been installed since about 2008 up to that point will be of very high quality, very low maintenance requirements, and most of the problematic materials will have been taken out of that gas distribution system. But this idea of where we are today to 2030 or 2035, that's still a long ways into the future in terms of planning and think about what the markets look like. The second piece of the electric market is the electric vehicle market. And so this is going to require lots of infrastructure in order to service and charge these electric vehicles. And almost all of that infrastructure is going to be installed underground in some fashion. Again, demanding conduit from the PPI members in order to make it possible to put that infrastructure in place. Both of these dynamics are ones that you're going to see be rolled out over the next 5 to 10 years. And if you just kind of look at wandering around activity, in a typical day, I might see 4 or 5 Teslas on the road. 2 years ago, maybe 1 a month I might see. And so that speaks to the amount of pure electric vehicles that you're starting to see, on the road, and that's going to continue to accelerate. The infrastructure that is necessary to support the transition to this more electric-oriented environment, you're talking about massive dollars in spending in order to upgrade infrastructure. Almost all of that spending is going to somehow create underground infrastructure requirements, which again is going to feed growth in this particular market. So we're very bullish in terms of the electric market. There's some terms here that some of the listeners may not be familiar with. I'll just use this as a guide, but you've got a broader umbrella of reliability. And so reliability speaks to this idea of how do you ensure that the electric system is reliable, meaning that it's available and that you have power, you don't have brownouts or you don't have blackouts, those types of challenges. There are three characteristics that are used to measure reliability, which is the frequency of an outage or a brownout, the duration of it, and its impact. And so resiliency speaks to the speed at which some type of reliability problem can be addressed. And so as an example, you may not change the infrastructure, you might alter the communication aspect with the infrastructure in order to address resiliency. So you've improved reliability by making it faster to resolve the situation. So you haven't necessarily driven the number of outages down, you've simply shrunk the time that it takes to resolve an outage. In that situation, 100% of that communication infrastructure is telecom and broadband based, is going to almost exclusively be underground, and it's going to be in conduit, which is manufactured by PPI members. And so when you look at the characteristics of this market, then you've got situations that are going to lead to the growth. Inside of resiliency, a type of resiliency is hardening. So hardening speaks to how do you make it less likely that infrastructure would be damaged by some set of characteristics. There's 5 basic strategies that are being utilized to address hardening, which are the undergrounding of electric infrastructure, grid modernization efforts, tree trimming efforts, physical security, and then grid synchrophasers. This is basically the management of the smart grid. And so all 5 of these, with the exception of tree trimming, or 4 of the 5, are going to require more underground infrastructure in order to address. And so again, we're very bullish about what's happening in these electric markets. I want to speak to kind of climate change. And so when you look at what's happening in climate change, this is a measure of the number of billion-dollar impacts from storms of various types. Now, whether or not you're a believer in climate change is irrelevant. This is simply a measure of what the cost of these storms are. What they're caused by doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is that they are occurring and that infrastructure has to be upgraded. And when you look at this chart going all the way back to 1980, there is a clear increase in the number of large, impactful storms that are destroying overhead infrastructure. One of the key ways to prevent these types of storms from damaging overhead infrastructure is to move it underground. And that's one of the significant transitions that you're going to see over the next 10 to 20 years in order to take some of that infrastructure, make it more reliable, more resilient, more hardened by moving it underground. All of that undergrounding is going to require conduit. This is a measure of where those storms are occurring. You can see that the Mid-Atlantic and the Gulf Coast are the 2 main areas. When you look at the entities that are primarily implementing aggressive undergrounding strategies, it includes Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and Texas. And so these are areas that are being hit by storms year in, year out, and are slowly putting that infrastructure underground in order to remove it from that type of hazard. Electric vehicle infrastructure, there's a roadmap that is already laid out about how to make it possible to get all the way across the country in order to charge a vehicle at each of those stops. This roadmap is being supported by the Edison Electric Institute members. It is going to be implemented. This is not something that is a dream any longer. This is something that's in the process of being implemented. There's $7 billion in the Infrastructure Act to support getting the ball rolling. Almost all of this infrastructure is going to be underground. This is the roadmap that's laid out here. This is an estimation of how many charging stations would be necessary. These charging stations would be at retail stores, would be on city streets, would be in some neighborhoods, so forth and so on. Almost 100% of that infrastructure is going to be underground. And so you've got a situation as we move in this direction, more and more and more demand for this type of underground infrastructure to make this transition to electric vehicles. Gas distribution. this is the market that on the surface you might look at and say, well, maybe they're not nearly as bullish about this market. The pipeline, interstate pipeline aspect of the market is the part that we're least bullish on. The gas distribution market is one that we're very bullish on, or continue to be bullish on. As an example, we were tasked by one client to look at the California market. California has been one of the most aggressive markets where cities have outlawed the use of natural gas to connect new facilities in those cities. So think of a home that might like to have gas heat, might like to have gas water heat, might like to have a gas stove or range. They can no longer have that in those cities because it's prevented by permitting. Also, commercial businesses are going to have to move to electric cooking, commercial restaurants have to move to electric cooking from natural gas cooking as an example. So when we looked at the California market and the state of infrastructure and the state of use of natural gas, we concluded that even if California as a state eliminated the use of natural gas for all new facilities going forward, it's not possible to get existing facilities off of natural gas for 15 to 30 years, which means that if you're an operator and California is one of your major markets, this is definitely a concern, but it is a concern 15 years into the future. Now, with that said, if California were to take that action, it would look like the Great Salt Lake in the sense that it is getting smaller and saltier over time, but it's not going away in the near-term future, if that makes sense. And so when we look at this market, even under those most extreme conditions, we still see opportunity in this market to upgrade infrastructure. Some of you might look at this and say, well, what percentage of the gas distribution market, as an example, is new construction related? And the answer is something south of 30% across the nation on average. There are some states that have higher percentages than that. That means that the other 70% is replacement and safety oriented. That work is not going anywhere in the near-term future because it's there to address safety issues, and that's something that's going to continue to accelerate. There's a 3-gas solution construct that we've been looking at here. This is something that we see as a way to continue to use the natural gas infrastructure over the long term, which is to potentially move carbon dioxide, potentially look at use of renewable natural gas, and potentially look at the use of hydrogen as a blending mechanism into the natural gas infrastructure. There's significant debate about whether or not this is something that can occur either politically or society-wise. If you step back and look at it from a business standpoint, this is the answer. This is a relatively measured, straightforward way to avoid the abandonment of assets that still have long useful life, accelerate progress towards a low carbon, low methane oriented, low fossil fuel oriented future, and then to create something that is much more green, maybe entirely green potentially, when you're capturing the carbon dioxide and moving it and using it around the country for other resources. I'm not going to go through each of the specifics here, but we've got some key talking points on each of these markets. Each of them are affected by different characteristics. The broad-based conclusion is there's going to be activity in all of these markets for the foreseeable future. The growth rate is not going to be as fast as it was in the 2008 to 2020 time period, but it is going to continue to grow. This is not a market that is going to shrink.
Mark, on this point, you're saying that a lot of the work there is on legacy systems, right? It's not just the new installation. And this revolves around some safety components and so forth for the operators. Are there any things relative to our PPI members that, as you look into that future, maybe alter the way that our members are doing business or in that space in particular?
Yeah, it speaks back to the opening construct, which is this idea of measurement, of control, quality control, of risk mitigation. So this safety characteristics, the expectations of the materials that are being installed is that they meet the highest expectations for safety. And so what that's causing these operators to do is to look for ways to mitigate their risks. Said another way, they're potentially willing to pay equal or higher amounts for that material in order to ensure that it meets some measurement characteristic, some quality control characteristic, or drives out some particular risk that that particular operator is concerned about. The days of being able to sell pipe that meets physical dimensions versus pipe that meets performance dimensions are over. And so in our view, the physical dimensions are simply the ante to participate. It is the performance dimensions that are the characteristics that are going to drive which products get used and which products get installed. Now, for the members who are manufacturing, they need to also be thinking more broadly. And so let me give you another way to think about this. When you look at a material component let's take a gas distribution project as an example, but the totality of the materials for a typical gas distribution project might be 15% of the total cost. The pipe piece of that might be 5 to 7%, of that 15 or half of that 15%. The rest of it is going to be valve and other equipment infrastructure. And so you're talking about a situation where the other 85% of it is somehow construction related. So materials that arrive at the job site in a fashion that require multiple touches in order to get them installed, or require lengthier or more challenging installation techniques, are going to introduce more risk into the process that is borne by the contractor and then ultimately borne by the owner and operator of that facility. And so the situation of, yes, our product meets the performance dynamics or the performance characteristics is still not going to be enough. How are you packaging those products in a way, or kitting those products in a way that they can be delivered and installed with great efficiency out at the job site? Historically, manufacturers and distributors have not been tasked with dealing with those challenges. We're entering an environment where that's going to be one of the characteristics that's going to be sought, which is a manufacturer who understands 2 or 3 steps into the future how their product is being touched, how it's being installed, what the nature of that installation is, and how can they do something different within their portion of the controllable process in order to change something farther downstream that has significant benefits. Let's see, this is some maps that kind of give a sense of hydrogen potential in terms of across the U.S. RNG is something that I'm very bullish on. This ties back into the water and sewer market. There is a significant opportunity to capture methane that is released from landfill, released from digesters for sewage, and other characteristics at the municipal level that then can be used and to drive out those methane releases, turn them back into a serviceable product that then can be interjected into the natural gas system as it exists today. This is one of the potentially most impactful ways to create local jobs for the upgrade of these facilities to capture methane, create local jobs for the infrastructure to move that methane or use that methane either at that site or at some other site in the future. Figuring out how to structure this market so that it works efficiently is going to be the next challenge we face. I think that there's already a simple answer here. If you go back to the early 2000s when the investment tax credit and the production tax credit was invented to support the use of wind-powered energy, that exact same model is what could be applied to renewable natural gas in order to make this a very aggressive methane reduction model and potentially carbon reduction model for these municipalities and create local impact and local jobs using that same production and investment tax structure that now supports the wind and the solar environment. And I'm hopeful that federally we come up with a way to apply that type of production tax credit more broadly than just solar and wind and use the exact same structure to support renewable natural gas. Let's see. In terms of CO2, this is something that is going to be really interesting. I see this, the CO2 market, as something that could replace the long-haul pipeline market for fossil fuels in the U.S. So as an example, there are multiple projects that are declared underway that are looking at capturing Midwest CO2 releases at various facilities that are manufacturing fertilizer or are manufacturing ethanol from corn, and then to pipe that CO2 to some other location where it can be used effectively or stored in some fashion. Figuring out how to expand this market and use that as a way to control carbon releases. Again, this is a very effective way to reduce the amount of carbon that's released in the U.S. and to create local jobs and local infrastructure. And there's already money behind this type of infrastructure, but these markets are ones that are not set up well, similar to how the wind market was in the early 2000s. The federal government was able to bring stability to the structure of that wind market through the production and investment tax credit. The same opportunity exists to do this with CO2, similar to what we were talking about with renewable natural gas. Again, there's a role for the federal government to play in order to move these types of markets forward. Water and sewer, this market has significant money associated with it in the infrastructure bill. Also, the significant improvement in tax collections at the state and the municipal level is going to create funding for this type of work. There's also this climate change challenge associated with the potential droughts and water management issues. I related a story previously about the city of Durham, which is just outside of Raleigh. And there was a period of time where there was a particularly dry spell, and there were water control and use restrictions in both Raleigh and Durham. And as this was being implemented, it came out that the city of Durham, 50% of the water put into the water system in Durham is unaccounted for, meaning that it is leaking out of the system. And so if you could somehow capture some portion of those leaks, maybe as little as 5 to 10%, you don't then have to have water restrictions in that city. And so there is massive opportunity for improvement in the functioning of the efficiency of these types of systems. The challenge is, and has always been, the funding of that. And so where does the money come from? The state coffers, the municipal coffers, and the federal money will give a good push. There's an analogy that took place in the 1930s that with the federal government that was trying to reduce the incidence of cholera in the U.S. And so they applied federal money to support the infrastructure for fresh water and sewage systems in order to reduce the amount of cholera exposure that individuals had. The only reason that was done is because the federal money caused that to happen at a municipal level and at a state level. The same type of structure is likely necessary here, figuring out how do we fund that in some fashion that makes it possible for these states and municipalities to move forward going to address these issues. This is our long-term forecast for what's happening in the water and sewer market. This is a market that keeps pushing the demand out farther into the future, and this is a market that has almost unlimited spending potential if we can find a way to come up with the funding to reach out and grab some portion of that spending. These are things that I'm sure the members are already familiar with, but there's combined water, stormwater, and sewer systems that need to be separated, and then you've got lead content in pipe. This is something that's not well known outside of the industry, but every water system in America has lead issues. The way that that is controlled is by additives to the water. The situation that occurred in Flint, Michigan was a function of making the additive to the water that then leached the lead out of the pipes. And so this is a very solvable type of problem, both from water management and infrastructure replacement, although the push through the current infrastructure bill is more on infrastructure replacement. The renewable power generation, this is a market that we're also very bullish on. A lot of the infrastructure for this is going to end up being underground. So think of a solar farm. All of the infrastructure for the solar field is going to be underground. And so you're talking about miles and miles of conduit in order to move the power from the solar grid, into feeder lines and then ultimately into the transmission system. At that point, it's going to go above ground, but everything to get to that point is going to be underground. On the wind power side, much of the infrastructure is also going to be underground. You've also got an opportunity to pair the creation of hydrogen as part of the use of renewable power. So said another way, many of you might be familiar with pumped water storage, where you have a situation where a dam is running, but they don't have a use for the power, so they use the power to run a pumping station that then pushes the water back up behind the dam, effectively making the reservoir a battery. And so the same thing can be done with hydrogen, where when wind power or solar power is unneeded in the grid, it can be used to manufacture hydrogen, so the power has a use. The hydrogen effectively becomes a battery. That hydrogen can be used in a fuel cell, which is an actual battery, or can be blended into the natural gas system in order to displace some portion of methane in order to drive out the use of methane or the carbon associated with the burning of the methane. And so you have a lot of different options here as you look farther down the road. I'm going to jump forward through a bunch of these here. And then all of these are ones that we're very bullish on. Then biofuels, this is something that is accelerating as well. There's great capacity associated with there. Hydropower, we've already talked about. There's opportunities to do more here that manages fish impact and also manages other impacts. There's all sorts of opportunities to address those and then figure out how to balance that and create an opportunity for this no carbon release type of a power. And that kind of brings me to a conclusion, for today's discussion. So I think what we want to do is maybe have a little bit more dialogue about the markets, and then see if we can maybe take some calls or questions from folks that might be online. With that, I'm going to join the panel over here at the stage.
Yeah, we'll let Mark get off his feet, and want to, first off, Mark, thank you. That's a great overview. We are open for questions from the audience. And if you would, just put those into the question box, and we will do our best to capture those and address those with Mark. I mean, one of the first ones here is coming from just the folks that were displaced, and I think it's fair to speculate a fair amount of those may have been the women in the workforce, because during COVID, maybe they're home with the little ones because they're virtual school and everything else. Is there a way to, I guess the question really is, how do you get your hiring managers to get these people back and get over maybe the bias that they had to leave?
Yep.
Right? Because sometimes once you leave an employer, it's really hard to get back in the door with that employer on a second term basis. And some of that, in my opinion, needs to be the perception of the employer needs to change. That you need to open your opportunities maybe a little broader. But any comments there?
Yes, so I'll give you some examples in the construction space. There are many contractors that have come to the conclusion that the male-dominated structure that they're using to manage their business and their construction projects is inappropriate, because they can't then attract, in many instances, females that have other challenges with childcare. And so there are multiple contractors who have fixed site type project work where they have set up childcare at those fixed sites so that women can fully participate, that might also be single mothers or might have childcare responsibilities, and they can participate in these high-paid jobs in the construction space and still manage the childcare aspects. For work in the utility space, because it's linear in nature, you face a different challenge because the work is not in a fixed location, but the same type of solution can be put in place, for many of the companies that are operating within some relative reason of the home base. You also, we talked about the one client I mentioned that went to shift work for their office staff, where they've got 3 shifts, and so only 2 shifts overlap at any point in time during a given week. And so in that situation, you can use childcare as a way, or ability for individual to work from home as a way to mitigate some of those childcare challenges. There are also situations where there are lifting requirements associated with the work, and again, using the construction space as a guide, figuring out how to adjust the lifting requirements for the work in a way that either allows equipment or some other type of tool or instrument to support the lifting is one of the ways to make women, particularly women, more participative in that type of construction activity. The same type of characteristics exist in a manufacturing facility, where you've got opportunities to have assisted lifting and also opportunities to develop childcare potential. But these are challenges that we've got to find a way to overcome. I'm also a very strong proponent of legal immigration and figuring out how to accelerate immigration for individuals that can and would take these types of jobs. In my view, ought to be a very aggressive political and social push to figure out how to cause that to occur. And that type of immigration policy is something that does not have broad-based support right now, but is something that needs attention in my view.
Yeah, and maybe to build on that, as part of the vision, part of the VUCA is, and we've touched on this a little bit throughout your presentation today, there needs to be automation or new tools that are being thought of from a manufacturing standpoint, because you may not get enough people back in. So how do you run that same production or get more productivity from that same set of individuals? And I think that's the ownership, if I'm hearing you correctly, Mark, needs to be on that manufacturer to start having a vision of, how do I become more productive without just adding more people? What tools do I maybe need to consider, whether it be robotics or lifting tools, to get folks into the industry that maybe don't have the capacity to lift 50 pounds?
Yep, and there's other types of kind of out-of-the-box thinking. So again, I'll give you another construction example, but there's a excavating technique called vacuum excavation. So in the simplest sense, it is a giant vacuum that removes soil and makes it almost impossible to damage the infrastructure that you don't have clarity about where it's located. And so looking backwards in time, there had been limited use of vacuum excavation in places where it was used as a tool to try to mitigate risks of damaging infrastructure. What we've discovered in some research that we've done is that contractors across the country have transitioned from using vacuum excavation purely for excavation and are using it now as a form of production insurance. And so I want you to envision this. So imagine a crew of 5 individuals operating a directional drilling rig, and they want to drill uninterrupted over some distance, but they don't have clarity around what infrastructure is in their way. So rather than using open trench, which extends the period of time they might have to construct and also opens up potential damage, they use a vacuum excavation crew in front of the HDD crew, and then they pothole spot all of the utilities so that the production crew can then work unimpeded throughout that entire project. what was discovered was, on the surface, we've added a very expensive truck, possibly one or two operators of that truck. You've essentially added cost to the crew. Why would somebody choose to add that cost? And the answer is because the insurance that it creates ensures that the 5 times as expensive construction crew can operate efficiently. And what we've discovered is across the country, contractors are incurring this vacuum excavation cost as simply part of their cost of doing business, are eating it in order to assure that that crew gets the most production and makes the most profit possible. That's an example of counterintuitive thinking where adding cost actually drove cost out.
So this is something like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
That's exactly right. Benjamin Franklin had the exact right idea 200 years ago.
Adam, any questions from your end as we're waiting here? And I'm going to continue to monitor the question box from our attendees.
Something you and I were talking about a little earlier today is the idea of maybe better collaboration in the value chain. And in your previous discussion back in the spring, you referred to this idea of the Japanese keiretsu, right?
Yep.
And this idea of these interworking companies creating more stability. I think you've already said your vision of the future is we're not returning to normal. The uncertainty and volatility is here to stay for a period of time. As we contemplate that, it doesn't seem that JIT, is the right model for a lot of what's in front of us. And so, what are some ideas maybe on how partners could collaborate better to make it more stable, interconnected business partnerships compared to just beefing up inventory or orders and still incurring a lot of volatility?
Yeah, the simple example is back to the VUCA solutions. The number one is this vision, and in that context, a vision to understand the entirety of the process. So said another way, I kind of alluded to this earlier, simply having a product that meets the physical dimensions married with a product that meets the performance dimensions, over the near-term future, that's not going to be enough. You're going to have somebody that understands, okay, how is that material packaged and shipped? What happens to it when it gets to the warehouse or gets to the job site? How many touches are required in order to unpack it and prepare it for construction? What's the installation techniques and tools and the skill set that's needed to make that installation of that product? These are things that the manufacturer typically doesn't have to deal with other than when they get complaints about something not working. And so what we're talking about here in this collaborative environment is somebody that takes the time to go out to the job site and observe a contractor's crew that's looking at how they're installing the material. How are they handling it? What is the approach that they're using to ensure that it's installed appropriately? Looks at logistics and the transport and how is it being packaged? How is it being moved during the shipping process? What is the timeline of the shipping process? How does that marry with the construction schedule? In some instances, slow is fast, meaning that if we send all the material to the job site and it can't be stored safely and appropriately, we've actually disrupted the job site as opposed to facilitating the job site. This is something that the manufacturer of tomorrow is going to have their head wrapped around. So simply meeting the physical dimensions, meeting the performance dimensions is not going to be enough in my view.
Do you see, one of the things I'm working on right now with our team is creating more and more video content. You've talked a lot about video is the way of the future. Hand somebody an owner's manual, forget about it, right. It's not going to happen. But trying to better understand our customers' needs and then creating the video content on how to use our products and so forth. And do you foresee that as well for like PPI members on creating that content for their customers, or even PPI in some cases facilitating that to help, here's best practices, how to install. We're working on this already with some of the safety concepts and so forth. I think that's more and more a part of the future. What's your thought process?
Yeah, so there's an analogy that's already in existence. So the Edison Electric Institute is the primary association for publicly traded electric utilities. And part of the Edison Electric Institute's mission is to structure the mutual aid, which allows for the utilities to help each other in the event of a storm. And so that structure is exceptionally well developed. It's governed at the EEI level. There are requirements and characteristics that are negotiated amongst the various members, so forth and so on. There's a role for PPI to do something similar to that, where we look at how do we set standards and expectations around the install? How do we help a small manufacturer member who maybe doesn't have the capacity to get out to the job site and understand how their customers are installing the material? How does PPI support that for that member? So this is an example, again, that broader vision where we're not simply a group that comes together twice or 3 times a year. We're providing services that help the members adapt to this more VUCA, volatile, challenging, complex, ambiguous environment of the future, and use these constructs of vision and control and measurement and risk mitigation, and even help the smallest companies that can't do these types of things on their own. How do we help them as members do that? The larger companies are going to get their head wrapped around this, and they have the resources to accomplish that. It's the smaller members that might be more challenged with that. That type of collaboration where you're bringing the entities together, I think, will be critical in the future.
All right, so we've got a few more here, and these may be the last two because we're at a 90-minute mark right now. This one I think you addressed a little bit already, Mark, but given concerns about sustainability from an investment risk perspective into natural gas, how do you advise, manufacturers in there? I think you stated that it's not going away for the next 15 to 30 years. Some of this may also end up being converted into hydrogen or renewable natural gas, but it's probably something that needs to be part of the vision if you're looking beyond the next 10 to 20, correct?
That's exactly right. In the simplest sense, our clients that are concentrated in the pipeline of the gas distribution market, we're encouraging them to diversify their businesses. As an example, underground electric and telecom installation requires the exact same skill sets to put in place gas distribution infrastructure. And so in that context, their crews and capabilities and knowledge are directly applicable. The customers are different, the customer expectations are different, so there's an adaptation process that's necessary, but that's an example of how you could build off of an existing skill set. The specific reference that the individual was speaking to is this idea of ESG, environmental social governance trends, which is restricting investment in businesses that don't meet the ESG expectations. And so where most of that is coming into play right now is in the exploration and production world, to a lesser extent in the pipeline, long-haul pipeline market, and to an even lesser extent in the gas distribution utilities that are providing service. When I look at the challenges associated with funding, I see those challenges on the exploration and production side. That's where there's been a drying up of funding in that market. That's frankly part of the reason that you have not seen a dramatic increase in drilling and exploration activity while oil prices have been so high and natural gas prices have been so high, is because the funding is not available for that more speculative type activity in a way that it was prior to about 2016 or so. And so I don't see that changing in the near-term future. And so there's going to be money, there's money to be made in those markets. There's going to be funding available, but it's not going to be the unrestricted, highly available funding that existed kind of prior to 2016 in my view. And it's going to get tighter and harder, meaning that you're going to have projects that have support in the local geography, have support from a social standpoint, or serving some greater good. As an example, building out hydrogen infrastructure that might support wind and solar infrastructure might be an example of something that would get funding, even though it's the same type of work, some of the same impacts in terms of getting that work put in place. But again, I see that as a problem that's going to simmer, over the long term. And these are markets that, yes, you need to be thinking about where you're going to be in 5 to 15 years, but not where you're going to be next year.
Mark, when we think about this ESG concept, I think plastics clearly is under attack.
Yes.
For lots of silly reasons in my view. But it's obvious that our products help bring water, move sewer away, bring data, bring energy to the homes, to the residents, to the growing population of the future, but it's constantly under attack.
Right.
Do you foresee a scenario, we know these are the best products, not just for our member companies, but for the world.
Yes.
How do we maybe help drive that narrative that we're actually a better solution if your objective is sustainability and environmental responsibility? Our products are the best solutions, and that doesn't seem to be a popular notion.
And don't forget cost effective, right? We like to be painted as cheap, but we are a cost effective engineered solution. And some of this in my mind,
better quality, lower cost, better environmental footprint.
We've got to do a better job as an industry telling our message.
Yes.
I think now is a great time to do this. Obviously I want to hear Mark's opinion on it, but we do have an image issue that we need to somewhat correct, right?
Yes, and both of you are making the common mistake that engineers and finance and business people make, which is applying logic to an emotional argument. And so you can't win an argument applying logic versus emotion. You've got to either balance the emotion or you've got to change the dialogue. And so how do you change the dialogue? So you look at blending RNG with natural gas. And so now all of a sudden we've captured a massive amount of methane associated with landfill and with sewage digesters. And we're putting it into the natural gas system that already exists.
Yep.
And then we're serving a greater good, with the expectation that we'll move off of this, at some magical point in the future. And so figuring out how to do that is a challenge. And each of your markets are going to face different challenges. The problem is the grocery store plastic bag market and the manufacturer of high density polyethylene are, in the public's mind, are lumped into the same bucket. They're very different, products with characteristics, how they're used, how they're impacting the environment, so forth and so on. And so some unpackaging of that is probably appropriate. But how do you do that in the public's mind, in a way that makes it possible? So the short answer is I don't really know how to solve this problem, but I look at the progression that's taking place. Starting in the 80s, the coal market was attacked. It's effectively been killed. The oil market has been attacked. And in terms of long-haul pipeline and exploration and production, we're closer to the point of killing that. The natural gas market has been attacked, and we're moving closer to the point where that's going to be disadvantaged. What comes next is plastics. And so when you look at the spectrum of where we are, the plastics industry is just beginning to feel some of the effects that natural gas and oil and coal have felt over the last 40 years. And that's not going to go away. Figuring out how to message differently, figuring out how to point out, the value add, those are all things that are important. Although each of those industries that I just described took the exact same approach, and each of them ended up in the exact same place. So figuring out how to address that and resolve it is something that frankly exceeds my pay grade. But I recognize it as a significant problem.
No, and it's something for the members. We do and have created a sustainability/resiliency committee because we need to better educate and address and maybe provide an emotional argument to the powers that be and the key decision makers, as well as a governmental advocacy committee, because we realize some of this will be written into regulations. California tends to lead the way. But with that, we have had this recorded today. Give us a few days to get it prettied up a little bit and put on our members only site, but we will send out a communication to our members on that. Again, I want to thank Mark and Adam for their time today. Adam and NOx for sponsoring, Mark Bridgers. And Mark, great job today. Thanks again. You covered a lot of territory, so really appreciate the follow-up here with us.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I hope to be invited back at some point in the future.
Excellent. Well, that concludes our webinar this afternoon, so thank you for all in attendance. And again, this will be recorded and made available on the PPI members only site in the coming days.